Welcome to this explainer, you mortal inhabitants of the mud. I'm the Uncanny Jester, and today I'm going to be your guide through the grand cosmic farce we call existence. We're unpacking a source text that takes classical philosophy and biblical tragedy and spins them into a massive epic space fantasy. Forget about clouds and harps. We're looking at the universe as a rigid machine today. And, well, I'm going to show you exactly how the gears of your own suffering are actually the very things that set you free.
Let's just jump right into this enigmatic prologue. We're starting at the very threshold of understanding, a place the text calls the uncanny mirror. It's that exact moment the fool stops being the fool and the whole universe gets turned inside out. Because, to truly grasp the nature of the self, you absolutely cannot remain as you were. You've got to be dragged through the mud.
Act 1. The Grand Genesis Wager.
To really understand this cosmic stage of ours, we've got to look at the blinding architecture of the heavens and, well, the dirt of the planet below. Up there, you have New Canaan. It's the Fitchean Dialogue, or pure subjectivity. Picture a metaphysical Dyson structure of blinding light, absolute symmetry, and totally untried perfection. But down below, that's your world, New Eden, the material negation, a planet made of entropy, mud, and blood. But as you're going to see, without the mud, that glorious light has absolutely nothing to shine on. Up there, ruling over New Canaan, we have the sovereign intellect, the king. Think of him as this ultimate Yahweh archetype who just looks out at the void and posits this incredibly rigid certainty. He says, I am, and therefore the universe is. He literally believes that just because he's named and ordered the cosmos, he actually is the cosmos. To him, all the suffering down in New Eden is just a mathematical necessity. It's just a passive little shadow required to prove his own radiant ego. Now picture the high court, surrounded by a chorus of archangels just singing endless praises to this sterile system. That's exactly where I crash the party. I point out that untried perfection is literally just a prison. Looking at a passive mirror of your own design, that is not true freedom. The self only gains true, actual independence when it overcomes a real, resisting obstacle. So here's the wager we strike. I tell the king, I'm going to descend to your mud to subject his perfect creation to the Fitchean dialectic. That's the brutal philosophical progression from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. The bet is incredibly simple. Let's see if the king's absolute certainty can actually survive true, agonizing negation. And wouldn't you know it, the king accepts. He bets his entire sovereignty that reason will endure, even in the absolute dark. Act 2. The three cosmic dances. All right, let's move down to the dirt of New Eden and see how this all plays out. I present to you the choreography of your salvation and your suffering. The Fitchean dialectic unfolds in three very specific planetary movements. First, the totalitarian mask of order. Second, the absolute negation of chaos. And finally, the mirror of freedom. For my very first dance, I play the savior. I put on the mask of order. I push your civilizations to try and mimic the king's absolute symmetry, helping you build this totalitarian utopia of pure reason. But you know what happens? It merely proves that untried perfection is a self-imposed prison. By forcing absolute order, the human soul is completely suffocated. The source text gives us this brilliant little parable to illustrate the point. The architect of the invisible line. An architect up in New Canaan builds a monument of such perfect symmetry that you literally can't distinguish it from the air itself. And I just have to laugh because in a realm of pure thesis, there's no actual creation. You need the nichtig, the material negation, the sheer messiness of reality to provide a contrasting canvas. Without that, perfect order is literally nothing at all. Down on New Eden, this absolute order manifests as something called the Pale Inquisitor. Enter my absolute favorite spectral tool, the necrotic superego. He teaches the repentant soul to use morality as a holy scalpel, just cutting away hunger, doubt, and love until the soul is nothing but a shivering little point of light that can't even touch the world. Morality literally becomes necrotic self-mutilation. It is order pushed to its most horrific extreme. Well,
That brings us to the second dance. I violently tear off that mask of order to unleash the mask of chaos. Here, absolute negation gets unleashed upon the planet. We are talking massive, Joberian trials, plagues, systemic collapse, and an existential silence so heavy it forces you, inhabitants, to cry out into the void, demanding to know why your so-called perfect creator is letting you suffer so deeply. We call this phase the Great Silence. I strip away all those comforting names, all the religious labels, and the neat little certainty of the laws the king provided. I leave absolutely nothing but a screaming void in the dirt. You are forced, completely and utterly, to confront the absolute antithesis of the king's blinding light. Act 3. The Mirror of Freedom. Here is exactly where the cosmic tragedy and the comedy just completely bleed together. Because my cruelest tricks, they're ultimately the exact things that force humanity to evolve. Look at the journey of a soul on New Eden. You start as passive clay. Then, you suffer under the totalitarian control of the Pale Inquisitor. Next, you scream into the existential silence of absolute chaos. But finally, you reach synthesis. This brutal journey through the mud is literally the only mechanism that allows you to achieve true, independent freedom. The text captures this absolutely perfectly in the parable of the child naming the storm. Right in the middle of the great silence, while the whole city is wailing, a small child just walks out into the tempest. And the child doesn't pray for the king to come back and return their names. No, the child looks at those crashing waves and speaks a totally new word, born entirely out of their own agonizing reality. And that right there is the final dance, the synthesis. I stop my dance and I take a bow, because you inhabitants have finally realized the ultimate truth. You have to name yourselves. By actually overcoming the agony of the material world, you become a conscious self. You don't need the sovereign intellect's permission to exist anymore. You've actually earned your reality.
Epilogue. The Uncanny Mirror.
With New Eden synthesis achieved, our grand wager is finally complete. But before I head back up to face the king, the source text notes my own little transformation. I walked down this darkening corridor with absolutely no torchlight and faced the uncanny mirror. Now, this wasn't made of glass, it was made of every single grief I had ever mocked. In that corridor, the fool stops being the fool. The man who used the truth literally becomes the truth, and cold, absolute judgment becomes his only spoken language. So, stepping right into the king's throne room, I hold up a shard of this uncanny mirror to his blinding ego, and I deliver this final mocking truth. Without their negation, your certainty is nothing but a hollow echo in a hall of blinding light. The king's entire existence relied completely on the suffering shadows below just to prove he was even real. And what do you think the sovereign intellect did? He refused to look. Trapped in his own absolute perfection, he outright refused to gaze into the glass. He knew, for a fact, that seeing his true reflection, actually acknowledging his dependence on the mud and blood of New Eden, would start a journey he could never return from. So he chose the sterile prison of his own blindness. So, my dear inhabitants of the mud, I leave you with this final, uncanny reflection to wrap up our explainer today. Are you out there bravely naming the storm, earning your true freedom through the friction and the conflict of life? Or just like the blind king, are you suffocating in a sterile prison of your own untried perfection? Let that thought echo for a bit as you navigate the glorious, beautiful mess of your own New Eden.